We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.
My name's Lou Balancia. I'm a professional engineer, electrical engineer, and professional expert witness. 80% of my work is involved with fire investigation. I never thought that would happen. What I have here today is what I call the Balancia Ignition Matrix. It's an organizational tool that allows a fire investigator in the field to collect all the information they have and know at the end of their investigation whether they have collected everything from that fire scene that they need to move forward with their investigation, what they need to take with them from the fire scene, what they can legitimately leave behind. The organization, the speed, the completeness of the collection of the evidence all improve the accuracy and the speed of the investigation. That saves time, that saves cost, that leads to better outcomes for both civil and criminal investigations involving fire or arson. Fire investigation is a difficult process at best. Things are very complicated. There's a huge amount of destruction that takes place as the result of a fire. What happens is the process of elimination has taken a bashing in the fire investigation community. NFPA 921, the guidance for fire investigation, NFPA 1033, there's certification requirements for fire investigators, have both taken a very harsh view of the process of elimination. And I believe that's because there have been a certain number of very high profile and very important cases where the fire investigator claims that they had ruled everything out but may not have documented that as completely. I'd like to quote Andy Lauersdorf here. Cause and origin experts must be able to articulate in an intelligent and comprehensible manner their application of the scientific method, which by its very nature involves the process of elimination. The Balancia Ignition Matrix allows fire investigators to organize their investigations, know when they're complete, and do it quickly. NFPA 921 is the guideline for fire investigators. This document in recent years has all but dismantled the process of elimination. What it does require in various sections is it says the investigator must list all of the fuels and all of the potential heat sources in or around the area of origin of the fire. So at the end of the day, the fire investigator has to list all the fuels that were potential first fuels for the fire and all the heat sources that were potential ignition sources for that fire. Considering each heat source in association or as a potential ignition source for each fuel creates a very large set of hypotheses. 6 fuels, 6 heat sources is minimal. 10 by 10 is more typical for compartment fire. It creates a very large set of fires that are very difficult to document and rule out in written form, each hypothesis. The dare here is to create both succinct and clear presentations, succinct and clear summaries of a fire investigation. The courts are correctly rejecting broad statements. Oh, I ruled everything out. They're rejecting these broad, unsubstantiated comments. They want the documentation, and the juries want the clear documentation. The Balancia Matrix is a way of capturing that documentation and then presenting it in a visual, analytic way. Eastern Kentucky University did a study of experienced and inexperienced fire investigators. They gave them a series of photographs and asked them to identify what in the photographs they thought could have started the fire and what they thought the first fuels were, and basically analyze the fire scene. They repeated this experiment, but instead of just asking for the bottom line, they asked them certain specific questions first. What fuels do you see in the room? What heat sources do you see in the room? What fire patterns do you see on the burned objects in the room? And then ask them to draw conclusions. The study made many interesting conclusions based on the demographics and the amount of years of study and so forth that the different investigators had. One of the key conclusions that they didn't draw, but is nevertheless true, is that following a procedure improves the accuracy of an investigation. You're more likely to find the true outcome of a fire if you follow certain procedural methodology as required by NFPA 921. NFPA 921, NFPA 1033, ASTM E678 all are requirements for the fire investigator to follow. 1033 defines the requirements for certification, but gets into what the fire investigator should be doing in the field. 921 is much more comprehensive. It says you've got to be thorough. You've got to look at all the fire patterns. You've got to look at all of the fuels. You've got to look at all of the potential heat sources. And you've got to consider all the hypotheses. ASTM E678 says, here's what you've got to do to evaluate those hypotheses. You've got to write down a rationale for each hypothesis. So if these are your fuels from your fire scene and these are your potential ignition sources from the fire scene, how do you document all of those hypotheses? This is one way to do it. This represents the same information as on that previous sketch. List your fuels, list your heat sources. Each square is the confluence of a heat source with a fuel. You can now look and say, I have a photograph of that heat source. I have a photograph of that fuel. Was it a competent heat source? Was it a competent first fuel? Were they in contact? Was the heat source hot enough? Was there actual evidence that that took place? Now you can summarize hundreds of fire hypotheses, fire ignition scenarios on a single piece of paper. This is not sufficient to do a report. Filling out one of these in the field just requires a pencil and a paper. It doesn't guarantee completeness. That still is up to the investigator. But what it will guarantee is that if you've done it well executed, you'll know by the time you leave a fire scene whether you've got all that information captured.